Okay, welcome everybody. Welcome to Break Down the Poet and the Poems, a conversation series to spread awareness of poets and their poetry as inspiration and motivation for everyday life journeys. I am your host, Tamara J. Madison, and this new season of Breakdown features poets who are writing what I call lineage literature. And it is literature based on or inspired by their personal family histories. And for this episode, I am excited to welcome Mr. Frank X. Voelcker, Professor Frank X. Voelcker, Poet Frank X. Voelcker, and many, many other things. Welcome to the show. Thank you for coming.
Thanks for the invitation. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. All right, so we're going to dive into his bio first. Multidisciplinary artist Frank X. Voelcker is professor in the Department of English and Creative Writing at the University of Kentucky, a Cave Canem Fellow and co-founder of the Appalachian Poets. He is the author of 13 collections of poetry, including Load In 9 Times, which is what we're going to talk about today, the winner of the 2025 Penn Voelcker Award for Poetry, and Turn Me Loose, the Unghosting of Medgar Evers, winner of the NAACP Image Award, and Buffalo Dance, The Journey of York, winner of the Lillian Smith Book Award. Voted one of the most creative professors in the South. He is the originator of the word Affrilatia and is dedicated to deconstructing and forcing a new definition of what it means to be Appalachian. The Lannan Poetry Fellowship Award recipient has degrees from the University of Kentucky and Spalding University, as well as 4 honorary doctorates from the University of Kentucky, Centre College, Spalding University, and Transylvania University. Whew. Welcome again, and thank you for coming. Obviously, you're really, really busy, so we appreciate your time. The first thing we usually do on Breakdown is I challenge myself, right, to write what I call a breakdown blurb for the book. I read and I study the book, and then I write my own blurb based on this particular platform. So I want to share that with you, and I want us to start off with that. Despite its militaristic title, Load In 9 Times by Frank X. Voelcker is a reclamation and reckoning to the endurance and persistence of a people determined to survive and shape their undeniable agency into legacy for the love and empowerment of future generations.
That's the book I was trying to write.
Yeah, well, it resonated very much for me. And I do that as a challenge for myself, just in terms of my own studies, but it also kind of lets the poet know where I'll be going in terms of the conversation. And it also informs the audience or those who'll be watching the video. So can we jump into a poem? Will you read the first one for us? Let's start with Let My People Go, just that first page on 61.
Let My People Go, Minister Gabriel Burdett, Company I, U.S. Colored Troops. As a man of faith, I must share this truth. The prayers and the God our captors offered in our state seem short on love and mercy. We watched like sheep from Fork's church gallery, sang their pious hymns, then gathered again in our own temple, veiled from prying eyes and ears. Their thin, cold songs were our first clue. We wandered the wilderness long enough to recognize his absence and his scorn. Children of God do not need a Jordan. We transformed the gospel into rivers, swam all the way to heaven in our praise. Where God is the lone master in his house, enslavement was not love, it was a sin.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. My first question for you is load in 9 times. Would you please share with us where the title comes from?
Sure. The title from the book, Loaded Nine Times, comes from the title poem, and that title comes from the actual instructions for how to load a Civil War era uh, rifle. And it was something that I came across while doing research about the Civil War. And it was a nice intersection for me because it allowed me to uh, kind of touch on one of the things that had always irritated me from the movie Glory. And the movie Glory was something I studied a lot and watched as a fan and as a quote unquote scholar. But there's a scene in Glory where the trainee uh, folds under pressure while the sergeant is trying to teach him to load the gun, and you have to load it in these 9 steps in the specific order so that all the soldiers on the front line can fire at the same time. And this soldier, uh, presumably a runaway, uh, was not able to complete the task. In the movie, he folds under the pressure, and that always bothered me. Uh, so when I came across the fact that that scene was from an actual specific way to load a gun, I want to do something with it. And then by the time we finished all the poems, uh, I just kind of gravitated towards that one as the collection title, even though my press rejected it at first. The editors felt like nobody knew what that was. But it was important to me that people kind of surrender needing to know something and be willing to find out on their own inside the book. One of my hopes was for people to re-experience what they thought about the Civil War, uh, but from a point of view that really had little to do with war itself. Uh, had more to do with people, specifically people of color in Kentucky, and their personal experience inside the war. Starting with the title, if you put the book down because of the title, then you weren't ready to enter the book, I think. But if you persevered, if that didn't keep you from opening the book, then I think that made you more ready to see that war in a different way. At least that's what I hope for.
Oh, no, it's more than a hope because you definitely did it. You definitely did it. Because I was thinking to myself last night, I was like, this book is a bit of a bait and switch, right? Because when you look at the cover and you look at the title, you just think that it's going to be more, like I said in the blurb, about this militaristic aspect and the way that people traditionally talk about war. But once I got into the book, I was like, well, wait a minute. This is something totally different. It pulled me in to the heart of a warrior and not just the stats of a soldier. And it's totally different. And I was thinking to myself last night, I was like, I wonder why he chose to use that, or why the press chose, whoever chose to use that particular cover with the uniform and everything. I was like, because it's a little bit off-putting for what actually happens in the book. But then I realized, but that brother's face, his
Mhm.
eyes and his face. And I tell you, I had this little book for a minute, right? And I just wasn't picking it up for a while. And I think it was because it was hard for me to look into his face and look into his eyes because there's so much happening there, right? You get a little thrown off by the uniform, but when you look in that face, there's a whole nother story. And you do an
Mhm.
amazing job of translating that. So tell us really quickly, let me see, who is Minister Gabriel Burdett? Let's start there.
Yeah, Minister Burdett was a black man from Gary County, Kentucky, uh, who before black men could legally fight in the Civil War, he was quote unquote hired away from his master to work for the Union Army. He was part of thousands of Black men who were hired from their masters by the Union Army to help build roads, to build forts, to serve these officers and soldiers, all white men, but not be rewarded personally for it. I think it was supposedly different than being enslaved, but they were still slaves, and they weren't being compensated. So that, kind of intensified their enslavement situation. But Gabriel was, I found him to be, pretty significant because his life story by itself, I always thought was worth a movie. And I didn't know anybody else who even had ever heard of him. But if you trace his life story, you get the full story of Black people in the Civil War in Kentucky. And so I knew that I couldn't fit his story in a single poem, so I challenged myself to try to write a heroic, crown of sonnets to kind of dig into and capture his as full a part of his story as possible. Although that I think I maybe only captured the Kentucky part of it because he left Kentucky and became part of the Exodus, and one of the exoduses into Kansas, and lived a whole other life after he left Kentucky, after trying, in a very committed way to make a living with his family here in Kentucky. But Kentucky wasn't ready for free Black people. And I think that's also part of the book and the story that people don't ever get, beyond the myths about Kentucky's relationship with the Civil War, and slavery. I remember being in school and hearing that Kentucky was a great place to be enslaved because there were no plantations here. That's one of the poems I knew I had to write that just pushed back against that mythology and the idea of what kind of place this was, and explain why so many Black men joined the Union Army, and also kind of pull the veil off this idea of that Camp Nelson was not just a camp for soldiers, that it also had this refugee site that forced the story to really be about Black families and not just soldiers anymore.
Absolutely. And you do that here. You do that here as well. And I want to let the audience know that in the back, there is a bibliography. There's a series of notes that direct us in terms of the inspiration of the poems. But I want to ask you personally as well, because this is the Lineage Literature edition of Breakdown, what aspect of your lineage is in this book or inspired it?
I started the book itself and the idea of the book before having the details that I had about my family relationship before the book and the research was done.
Really?
I was actually hired to write some short bibliographies about Black Union soldiers for this organization called Reckoning Inc. And they wanted to put them all online and have a website where you could go and find out in detail what Black men did during the Civil War. And halfway through my commitment to them, I asked if I could also include poems because I kept finding information that was so inspirational that I wanted to attach a poem to the bios. And they accepted the poems. And then before I was finished with my commitment, I asked them if they would mind looking in their database and see if there was any information about one of my ancestors that we suspected but didn't have any hard evidence that he had fought in the Civil War. And I just sent them a name.
Wow.
And a week later, they sent me a 99-page document with enlistment papers, medical records, affidavits, signatures, details about 2 different family members and 3 if you count the widow that filled out many of the affidavits, and it just blew me away that these details were available, and that this was my relative. This was a third great great grandfather and his son who were at Camp Nelson, and I never knew that. Uh, and it just, I think it deepened my commitment to the work, and I hope that kind of passion and also the kind of focus on the family aspect and not just the soldiers. And even the soldiers, I wanted to not disconnect them from their families, because while at Camp Nelson, their families were also there in the refugee camp. So, they weren't just fighting for themselves to be fighting, they were fighting for their family's freedom, that continued freedom that they were experiencing in real time.
That was something that stood out to me, the fact that you use the term refugee in the book. And I thought about how at this time, refugee is already always used for something else, right? But you used it in terms of the Civil War, and I thought that that was really, really interesting. But that passion for the family, the holistic soul of the story really, really came through for me, because I found myself clutching my heart a number of times, like, oh my goodness, right? So I want to go to the first one, the first poem that had me doing that, because I am a man. That's the poem when my husband woke up Sunday morning, I was like, baby, you got to hear this, right? And that particular piece right there, I've been dying to hear you read it out loud, please.
Well, the next time you and your husband are traveling, make your way to Lexington, Kentucky, because there's now a statue and a public monument dedicated to Lewis and Harriet Hayden right across the street from a house they lived in downtown Lexington. I wanted to write this one because I wanted to tell Kentucky's story in a larger way than people knew it. And most people connected Lewis Hayden with Boston and not with Kentucky at all. But he had escaped. He and his wife and his son had escaped from Lexington before he had his more famous reputation as this kind of warrior on the Underground Railroad. But I'll read Because I Am a Man in the voice of Lewis Hayden. Bondage taught me that our dead son's cold grave would always yield more peace than horror, forced upon us by the ghost of the son sold away forever. Because I am a man with conviction, when we escaped Lexington through stations in Ohio and on to Canada, it only seemed right to settle in Boston, to commit to providing shelter and protection for others, and to aid as many travelers as possible. Because I am a man with no son I could ever touch again. Our Boston boarding house was more than a way station. It was a chance to spoon bowls of freedom soup, to fluff pillows for the heads of every refugee child, as if still tucking in my own, then standing watch over their first peaceful night's sleep. Because I am a man shredded by sorrow and unafraid of death, I keep a keg of dynamite tied to a long fuse in my basement. Freedom, yours and mine, is a right I would gladly pay for with my life, because I am a man. That's Lewis Hayden.
I had to read that first stanza a few times, right? And I have a question for you, and I hope this question makes sense. I wanted to ask you, how did you get to the tender of this poem? And I want to say that when I say the word tender, I'm not talking about tenderness, right? Usually when we talk about tenderness, there's a softness or what have you that comes with that. When I say tender, I'm talking about tender that sometimes might be money or something used to barter in exchange, but also tender as in a place that hurts, that's
Mm.
tender to the touch, that you can barely stroke it and the ache is there, a place where sometimes when you think it has totally healed, that ache wakes up again. How did you get to the tender of this poem? And the reason why I'm asking is because when I was talking about it to my husband, I said he does such an amazing job of talking about the masculine with so many layers, so many layers, and in such a holistic way, because the protector is here, but the one who sacrifices himself in a different way is here, right? Because this man lost his sons, and he could have easily just gone on about his journey and not paid attention to any other mother's sons, but he did, right? And I'm sure that every time he looked into the face of someone's son, he saw his own son. So my question again is, how did you get to the tender of this poem?
Yeah, thank you for that question. I think part of it was driven by the fact that, I read a whole book about Lewis Hayden, and this is the only poem that shows up that references him. So I was, trying to carry those 200 plus pages, into these little stanzas. Uh, but I think it wasn't just his story. I think it was a story of the Underground Railroad for me. Part of my research included watching the Harriet movie several times, uh, and trying to appreciate what it meant to travel in this time period of with the whole family. The struggles, the of it's not like you could just get on a bus and go where you need to go, or have a horse and wagon, or any kind of carrying instrument, that sometimes these individuals may have been barefoot. And I just thought about what it took to keep a family intact. So my heart was wide open in all of this, and I think part of the reason I wanted to share so much research material, and there are so many notes, uh, is because I didn't want to separate the materials that kind of set the stage for the poems, from the poems themselves, because I think it's worth getting the extra information to understand where they came from, and to be reminded uh, that these are real people, that this wasn't a work of fiction, uh, that some of the things they said and some of the situations may have been fictionalized, but everything is based on real folks who suffered, who struggled, uh, who yearned for something that was denied them. Um, and because I lived and worked in the same space that these people had lived and died in, I really felt like I had access to them. Uh, I could carry them with me every time I added more research material or stood up photographs. The book cover uh, is one thing, but there are at least 3 poems inside the collection that are written after staring at photographs of soldiers, and doing the same thing you did, gazing into their own face and seeing somebody real and trying to interpret what all those wrinkles and lines and frowns and nobody smiling, uh, what everything meant, and trying to imagine what it was like for them. Uh, it just brought me closer and closer. So I felt like it was my obligation to tell as much truth as I could, because I wanted people to come and arrive at the same place that I was writing from. That this was a book about Black families, uh, and it just happened to be a civil war going on, uh, and that was more important than it being a book about the Civil War to me.
That translates, and that's the perfect, perfect, perfect segue, because I wanted you to go into Of Course next on page 47 with Margaret Garner.
Ah,
Yeah, that
Yeah,
right there.
this is one of two Margaret Garner poems in this collection. And again, these poems are driven by also wanting to deepen people's knowledge about Kentucky's truth regarding the Civil War. And many people who are fans of Toni Morrison know Margaret Garner's story, know Beloved, but don't know that Margaret Garner was a real woman from Kentucky, and her story happened in northern Kentucky and Cincinnati and back. Um, and so this particular poem allowed me to make sure women were present. You know, my wife is always my first reader, and one of the things she always says when I enter a collection of history, she says, "Where are the women?" You know,
Mhm.
uh, and so I was trying to get ahead of her criticism because I knew what she would say. So this is a poem called "Of Course" in the voice of Margaret Garner. I'm not surprised so many of our men enlisted give over their lives to see their mothers and families free. No matter who their daddies be, they come here through black mamas. We made them all mule, mean, and molasses. That kind of love and pluck and sacrifice can only come from us. Same for that kind of strength. We only have a few seasons to pour so much iron and oak into them, no slaver could ever beat it out. But they should have mustered me too. It take gumption to give over your life. It take even more to take one. Oof.
Frank, you did good. You did good. Okay. You did beat it to the punch on that. Because I have to tell you, I didn't expect to see any women's voices at all. Right.
Mm.
And then when I read the women's voices that were in there, my first thought was, oh, this is a man in love. And not only a man who is in love, but a man who takes a woman's wisdom seriously, right? Because you can be in love and not really be prepared to receive the wisdom that is waiting for you, and or there may not be any. But I was like, no, he's done some listening before he even got to this. And so that
Oh
was
yeah.
a very pleasant surprise in the book. And you answered my question because I already had it on here. I was like, what made you think to include women's voices? So you already answered that. You did a great job with that one.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's something that this is my, I guess, sixth or seventh. This is a sixth. There's already a seventh uh, collection of historical poetry. And the very first one I wrote, women's voices were absent. It was in the voice intentionally of one person. That was York as part of the Lewis and Clark expedition. But one of the first things that kept coming up in my readings from that book, people kept asking me, what about the women? Where are the women's voices? And I had to plead guilty, but it had not been my intention to give voice uh, to other points of view for that book. I was just trying to enter a Black point of view. But they let me know really quickly that uh, it was still incomplete. That if I didn't add more voices, especially uh, the voices of Black women, uh, it was still the truth was thin and incomplete. So uh, the second York book I wrote uh, is predominantly in the voices of women, uh,
Mm,
and every historical collection since then has been intentionally round and full in that way to make sure that it feels more like the truth because you have these divergent opinions sometimes. But uh, I don't think you get the whole story if you haven't heard from women.
right.
I know that, I
Right.
have seven sisters, so uh,
Mhm.
something I've known in my bones a long time. But I learned it writing these kinds of books as well.
Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening and for following through on that.
Mhm.
I want to go to page 49 next. We will prove ourselves men. And again, the women are there. It may be a man's voice, but the women are there. I took note of that.
Mhm. Yeah, it was important to me to to let them be everywhere they should have been. This was when I saw uh, a picture of a regimental flag that belonged to the 127th U.S. Colored Troops, and read that uh, the words "We will prove ourselves men" was sewn on the flag, and did more research to find out that these were Black women's hands that made this particular flag. I was moved, of, and I tried to bring them closer to the story. So I'll read "We will prove ourselves men," sewn on the regimental flag of the 127th U.S. Colored Troops. I don't look to the stars and stripes, nor the eagles for mustard, like the white officers and some of my free brothers do. I think on the slender fingers that stitched our proud colors, snapping in the wind, the same steady hands that last held me close and pray they hold me again. That's why I'm willing to trade bullets in a cloud. Some confuse our bravery and courage with our love for our women, but many of us just eyeing that flag and trying our best to get back home.
See, I read this entire book, like, and pieces of it several times without crying. But it's something about when I hear your voice read it, I've been trying to like keep back tears. And I want to tell you, thank you so much for considering that, right? And for not only considering it, but bringing it to the forefront. For years, when I have seen, oh my goodness, documentaries or read histories and done all kinds of things like around the civil rights movement or the Harlem Renaissance or um, even this time period, you always hear about what the men are getting done. And the question that always goes through my head is, but who was cooking though? Right? Who was cooking? Who was feeding these people? And how that is never considered. And it's pissed me off like before, right? And I've thought about it. I was like, but who was washing the clothes and who was darning and who, and I'm thinking about these things, of course, because I'm a mother, right? And I'm a wife as well, or partner. And I just feel like all of that gets missed. So for me to write about it is one thing, but for a male poet to say, I see you, I'm bringing this to the forefront, I'm making note of this, um, it takes it to a whole nother level because women will talk in the kitchen and we'll be on some they think they out there doing something, but you know what I mean? That happens a lot, and we have to do that for ourselves. But that acknowledgement means a lot, and it just shows how expansive this love is. You know what I mean? It really, really shows that. And I wanted to ask you, when I started making note of the love story in this book, right? And I don't say love stories, but I mean the love story, both of them, right? Like the love story of a people as well as the individual love stories. I was curious to know, did these love stories unfold towards the end of the writing process of this, or did they show up in the middle, or do you even remember?
The poem, I wasn't writing the poems in order.
Mm-hmm.
I was writing the poems in response to the research material that I came across, in pieces. But I think they were there from the beginning. I think for me, once I recognized that I wanted to make sure that people understood what a refugee camp was, and that Camp Nelson was also a refugee camp, which meant that there were Black families, there were women and children, and older parents also present in the same space as these Black soldiers. How much that had to change everything. And the only way that made sense to tell it for me was uh, to make sure that everything was grounded in this love, because something had to drive the sacrifice. I mean, what other reward were they getting? Of what was bigger than, they weren't just fighting for themselves. Uh, and I think it's also a way for me to, I think the challenge of writing historical poetry is that as the author, you're supposed to stay out of the way and tell the story of the period and those people. But I think the emotional temperature, the heart, uh, at the core of the narrative, is the responsibility of the author. I think for me, that's where I get to live in the story, because I know about large families. I know about sacrifice. I know about a Black woman's love. I know about children and sons. I know about loss. And so when it came time to write poems that borrowed from those little snatches of real life, I had sources already to borrow from. I knew what that felt like, and also knew that it was important that those speakers could touch those feelings and speak from somewhere that was authentic, so that when people who were also familiar with that same space, when they read it, they would recognize it immediately as authentic.
I do want to shift back though for a second. There is that piece that you have in there about the soldiers, according to
Who, who
order,
can't
having to
who can't sleep
retreat.
at night?
Yeah, no, 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 not those.
Okay.
Because that was humor too. But going back to that tender place, the soldiers who had to retreat and leave the wounded behind, knowing
Oh,
they would be slaughtered.
mhm.
When I read that piece, I really have no words for it. But the question that I have for you is, how did you care for yourself? Like yourself as a person when moving through spaces like this and churning them out to share.
Yeah, I have the advantage all through the research and writing of this book. I did it all from home.
Mhm.
Uh, I have a studio out back, so I could write and bleed on the page if necessary, or read something that really broke my heart. But I could also like walk away from that space and go in the house and hug my wife and pick up my son, uh, curl up in a blanket together on the couch and be healed in real time. Uh, I don't know how people write this kind of work alone. Uh, I couldn't do it. I don't. I think to deal with this kind of pain, uh, I think you have to have some, even if it's not worked out in advance, you have to have some mechanism to not be consumed by it.
Mhm.
Because I didn't want to write something. I don't want people to talk about how dark this book was. Um, it gives me joy to hear you say, uh, to mention love in connection to this book, or a love story, or love stories plural. Um, because my wife also said, she appreciates the many love stories that show up in this book. Uh,
Mhm.
and that was something that she was grateful for, because it was unexpected. And
Mhm.
when you say war, you immediately go somewhere else emotionally, and you're not expecting tenderness or love. Uh, and when it shows up, or the potential for it to show up, there's always disappointment tied to it. But there are many cases where uh, the end of the poem is not disappointment. You know, uh, it's these little small victories, especially when you get towards the end of the book, uh, that kind of make it easier to move through the entire book, so that there's not this one big dark depressing narrative. That there's, there you see Black people and Black love and resilience in the face of all these obstacles, how it survived, and how we loved, how we reprogrammed and redefined what family was because of love, uh, and how every hand dealt to us in that situation, we made the best out of it, and that's been our story.
There are so many other narratives and erasures and revised histories out there that would have us believe something totally different. And so it's very important to confront that. Um, and I'm very
Agreed.
grateful that
Yeah,
you did that.
100%. I mean, I think that's uh, especially when you consider the dominant narrative about uh, Black families and how fragile they seem today, in spite of what we came from. I mean, if you look at Black families in post Reconstruction, uh, man, if every Black child could read a book that or see a movie that brought that into their purview up close and personal, I think it would change how they entered into relationships as young adults. I think, but I also understand how uh, these kind of stories would be considered dangerous for those people who want a different narrative, who want a different future and result, who want specific results and outcomes for Black people. Um, but for that reason, I'm happy to claim the label activist when sometimes I'm introduced as such. Um, but I think this is I I'm I don't ever sit down to write a pretty poem for the sake of entertaining something or somebody. Um, I'm trying to preserve these narratives that when you shrink it all down, uh, after so many books, they're all about the same thing. They're about family and social justice, uh, and our survival and history and the importance of all that. And it's just on a different cover every time, but it's still the same thing.
So let's go ahead on and dive deeper into that hope. Let's go to that last poem. I felt like I was asking myself as a writer and as an editor, I was asking myself, okay, why is this the last poem instead of the one before it, right? And I decided that for myself as a reader, I looked at the very last word, and the last word is dream, right? So to me, there's sort of an ascension in the narrative that happens because the last word is dream, if that makes any sense. Would you read this for us, please?
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you for this choice. I actually think about this as kind of a bookend for the Lewis Hayden poem, and it references to his son, and that kind of masculine, Black male love for our offspring. Um, but I lived 2 blocks from Charles Young Park in Lexington, so my son plays. He says out loud, "I want to go to Charles Young uh, at least once a week." So the idea of Charles Young lives in real time in our household, and so it's a real, and at the park there's a whole historical uh, set of markers that detail his whole personal history that is ground in and written in the playground where the water park is that my son plays on. So this person and this place is very special to me. So there were many reasons why this had to be the last poem. Um, A Black father dreams a son. Brigadier General Charles Young, 9th U.S. Cavalry Regiment. It was 12 miles to Maysville and the Ohio River, and another 10 to Ripley. A runaway could escape from Mays Lick at night, head north, follow the smell of the river, and make the entire distance and crossing by sunrise. A determined one on horseback, like Gabriel Young, could make it in half the time. Ignoring racism at West Point was easier, knowing my father survived slavery. He joined the Fifth and risked his life so our people would know freedom. I risked mine to protect it. If his sacrifice and commitment freed my body, my mother's books freed my mind. Her skirt was my first classroom. Every big and small thing I've done began at their feet. Though born into slavery in Kentucky, I learned to play piano and violin, speak French and German before becoming a teacher, before graduating from West Point, before a career in the military and public service. Growing up in Ripley showed me what this country could be, what my parents instilled in me, and Wilberforce proved it. I am America's promise, my mother's song, and the reason my father had every right to dream.
Yes, sir. Yes,
Mhm.
sir. Yes, sir. We all are. Yes, sir. Absolutely. Absolutely. And thank you for making that connection between the son that was lost and the son that is being dreamt. I didn't think about that, and that's important to keep in mind.
Sure.
I've never done this on breakdown before, but I asked Frank X if he would share one of his poems with me and allow us to do it in a duet reading together. And I think you'll see why when we do it. It's called Black Love Day. And thank you for being so gracious to do this.
Yeah, I need to say in advance that the context of this poem was finding out that we know there had been a time when it was illegal um, for Black men and women in Kentucky to be married legally. Um, but there also came a time when it became legal to do so. And when this happened in Kentucky, it just happened to be uh, Valentine's Day.
Mm.
So my wife and I don't celebrate Valentine's Day, but we do celebrate Black Love Day. So this, you know, makes it more personal for me as well. We scraped together the 50-cent fee, then a bit more for the certificate, and picked and carried over a little something from our garden for the minister.
Now that we finally owned ourselves, we put down the broom and jumped at the chance to own our promises too.
We had practiced as much husbandry as owners believe was profitable, been forced to carry uninvited seed to fruition, yet shared cabins or memories of a broom jumping with somebody we choose on our own.
And no matter how long ago, we figured out how to have and to hold, to stand for God.
And say, I do was mighty special.
Yeah. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Oh, that was such a touch of sweetness. Um,
I was thinking the same word. That was sweet. That was so
yeah,
sweet.
yeah. I was like, and I was a little afraid to ask you because I was like, it is his poem, Tim. He might not want you messing with it like that, but I was like, I'm gonna give it a shot and see what happens. So what do
No,
you
I mean,
want?
I think, yeah, I was gonna say that you say that it is my poem, but I don't think of it like that. I think these are
Mm,
our poems.
mm,
Of anybody who loves in a way that is familiar, and finds that in these pages, you know, these are your poems. If you believe in Black families, if you understand that it's such a threat for a specific reason because they have power and what they can produce,
mm.
uh, and how they can strengthen and embolden, of and how it's the reason we're still here. If they had managed to break Black families permanently, none of us would be here today. And I think the reason we're here, uh, and thriving, many of us are thriving. We're not all suffering in the ways that television likes to traffic in, but we're writing books, we're teaching at universities, we're line dancing, in the middle of wars around the world, but we're still here. And I think none of it would be possible if we hadn't figured out that how essential love was to that formula to have us here.
Okay, so you just answered my last question. I just, that was going to be my last question, but you answered it already. And I have to say that after meditating on the book, load in 9 times feels like it's not just about that rifle, but it's about how many times we forgive and find ways to keep loving. Like
Yeah.
loving it again.
Oh,
No
I
matter
would
what
agree.
happened. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and the reason it's the title poem also is that that poem is a love poem.
Mhm.
Of and you have a man loading his rifle, but he's thinking about his wife, uh,
Yeah.
and her, violation, and his need to defend her, uh, and avenge her. Uh, that poem closes by him imagining how many times his master beat his wife.
Mhm.
I mean, that's what he's thinking about while he's loading that gun. And for me, if that gentleman in the movie Glory had a different motivation, he would not have capitulated under the pressure and had been able to complete the task. Of, had he been thinking about his wife, he'd have pulled every trigger and loaded and had that thing locked and ready. Uh, but I didn't write that movie,
Mhm.
and whoever did was not familiar with that type of motivation, or nor did they understand that scene would be hurtful in a lot of ways. Because I think one of the things that I kept coming across was when they refused Black male entry into the Civil War, they kept saying over and over again that we didn't have the gumption for it, that we couldn't go to war, we couldn't fight, we didn't have the courage. Um, and if you look at the facts, everything proved that to be a lie. But it was just, propaganda, more reasons to paint a picture of us that was not true.
Mhm.
I really appreciate your choices. Every poem you chose are not poems that I think I've read publicly at maybe 40 readings I've given. And none of those poems were, requested or read as part of, a reading. But, I think your choices put together a narrative that really, I think, supports the spine of this book, that this story about Black love and Black women's role at the center of it, and that this is not a book about war. That is a book about surviving war, um, and how to do it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for trusting me with all of this. Because I know all of it was sight unseen in a whole bunch of ways. I am just so honored and so grateful. Again, I know that you're crazy busy. You're on residency right now. You took a little time away from that to come and to share with us. And so I thank you, thank you, thank you. For those of you who are watching or who will watch when this airs, thank you for coming and joining us for this episode. There will be more information down below about this poet and what he is doing and what's coming up next. And we hope that you will join us again for the next breakdown.
This opportunity is made possible through the Literary Arts Projects, a program of South Arts.